Our next feature for North Carolina Heritage Fair will be Freeman Owle. That is O-W-L-E. Freeman comes to us all the way from Cherokee, North Carolina. And Freeman is he is special in many sense of the word as a Cherokee tribe member. He also has served as an elder in the Eastern Band of Cherokee there in his area. But he comes to us today to share their heritage, both in the forms of storytelling and from the stone carving that they are known for. He also works with the beadwork, the tradition of beadwork in their tribe, and most importantly, life lessons. He shares everything that the Cherokee would share within their community and from generation to generation that have built their values and their culture on. And so I'm sure that you will enjoy hearing from Freeman Owle today as he tells stories of his people and does some stone carving as well.
Hello, my name is Freeman Owle. I'm a member of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation. And we live in these mountains in western North Carolina, and we have relatives who, during the Trail of Tears, moved to Oklahoma, and we call those folks out there the United Kituah Band and the Cherokee Nation. And so there's probably 260,000 who live out in Oklahoma. But out here in the mountains of North Carolina, there's like 17,000 Eastern Band members who live here today. If we go back many, many years, we realize that the Cherokee people have been here for thousands of years. During those thousands of years, they owned parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. That consisted of 240,000 square miles of territory. And eventually we would lose 100% of our land. And were put on the reservations like in Oklahoma, as well as we had a small band of land over here called the Qualla Boundary in western North Carolina. And that's all we had left. But there's such a rich heritage there with the people that do remain, and Native American people are only like 0.7% of the total population. And almost every other minority greatly outnumbered us. But at one time, we used to be 100% of the total population. One of the stories that I'd like to tell you today deals with this little tool here that is called a stickball stick. And it's where lacrosse came from in the very early days. And it played by picking up a ball, a small ball about this size off the ground, and then you take it out of the basket of the stick and you run for dear life because everyone else is going to be chasing you down, trying to stop you from scoring. The people who score the first 12 points are the winners of the game. And it can get pretty rough. The only rule is that you cannot pick up the ball with your hand, but you can use this to slow the other person down or to stop them in any way of making that score. So you have to pick up that ball and you run from one end of the field to the others a lot of times, and you make those points, and whatever argument the people had going on was settled during that time. I know that even in Peru they have this, during the Christmas time during the year, they have these fist fights that men, women, and children get out there and they settle all of the arguments they've had. And they fight, and you can actually see that today if you're interested. But the Cherokees would play stickball instead. It reminds me of a story that was told that the animals and the birds began to fuss and fight and argue and carry on, and the women in the village, which the Cherokee were matriarchal, and the women were basically in charge. Women said, "We're tired of listening to all that noise. We want you just to sort of play stickball and settle this argument." And this old story has a lot of good teaching within it. And so they began to back and forth and choose teams. The animals, the captain of the animals was the bear, and the captain of the birds was the eagle. And so think about the difference in the vision of a bear and an eagle. And so the old bear began to choose the big animals in the forest, and he chose the mountain lion and the bobcats, and right on down to the little tiny chipmunks. And he began to say, okay, I have one of every family, and I'm finished now, I'm ready to play. But they said, wait a minute, we hear someone coming. And there was a little mouse that came running through the leaves, and he began to yell, and wait for me, you forgot me, I'm sorry I'm late. But the old bear got a little upset with him, and he said, look at you, you're so small and tiny. He said, we don't want you on our team. He said, you're just a little runt. Why don't you just go away and find something else to do? So the little mouse begged and pleaded, and the bear kicked him, and he went tumbling away, and he got up, and he began to limp, and he says, if you don't want me, I'll go play for the birds. So he went looking for the eagle. And eventually he found the eagle and told the eagle, said, I want to play. The bear has been mean to me, and he won't let me play with his team. Can I play for the birds? And the eagle looked at him and said, yes, you can. He said, can you fly? Of course, the little mouse couldn't fly, and he just started walking away. And in Cherokee, the old eagle looked down at him and said, Godzowicteen, Justeen. That means, where are you going, little mouse? He said, I can't fly. How can I be a part of your team? He said, we'll make you some wings. Then you can fly. So they got some wet sycamore bark, and they began to mold those things into wings, and the woodpecker made holes around the edges, and they sewed them behind the front legs of the little mouse. And they took him out and threw him up in the air that day, and he began to fly a little bit, and he began to practice all night long. By the time morning came, it was like he was darting it through the wind. He was flying so quickly. They went out the next day, and they threw the ball up in the middle of the air, and the little mouse grabbed that ball in his mouth, and he scored every time they tossed it up in the center. He scored 12 points and won the game for the birds that day. And if you look up at night, in the fall, in the summer, in the spring, you'll see this little mouse flying around even today. We call him the bat. So many times we talk to children, and they love that little story because it's inclusive. You don't leave anyone else out just because they're small. And that's one thing that the Cherokees have been teaching for thousands of years. And it's very fitting and very appropriate even today, and sometimes especially today. We must be inclusive with these things. And the Cherokees told a lot of stories. And you can tell that we've been here a long, long time, because we have tools that we made and we used. This one is a blowgun that was used to get food with. They didn't have guns that they could shoot things with and just destroy them. The Cherokees used things as they needed them. And so they didn't like going out and killing the whole herd, all the buffalo at one time. They only took what they needed. And so the blowgun was a lot of work, and you had to really be good to get at least one animal or something. But they always said a prayer before they used or killed and took the life of anything. So the blowgun was a tool, and you can sort of hear it and listen to it. You can't see the dart hit the target, but listen. You can hear it. So that dart is made out of Scottish thistle, and it was not ever poisoned. And so Cherokees would not eat any meat that had been poisoned. So it was very important that they use a dart that would not poison us. So Cherokees did that. And another thing you can find in the soil, if you walk out into the fields, you can find axe heads like this, that the handle is sort of rotted away from and is gone. It's made out of stone, and it's all natural, and these things are beautiful, and they date back 15,000 years, many of them do. This one is not as old as some of the others, but this one is a very, very old piece right there. It's been picked up in the fields here in North Carolina. You can tell it's sort of slanted one direction. And that would have been used to scrape out the ashes, or where they'd burn the trees to make canoes from the inside. It had a handle on it, and it would be pulled back and forth like that. And I come down here to Alexander County and to this area and get soapstone to carve on. And I've carved an ugugu, which is an owl in Cherokee. And my name is Owle also, Freeman Owle, and say, Sio Dagwato A Ugu Gu. Hello, my name is Owle. So the reason I carved the owl is because the owl is, even in the Cherokee belief, that he is sort of like a conjurer, and that he can be a shapeshift creature as well, and people can change themselves in from a human into an owl, and sometimes people are afraid of the owls. So when you go out and you see people have the owl feathers on these wands and they're dancing around, they are not Cherokee people because they're afraid of the owl feathers. That is like they call it a skilly or a ghost, a shapeshifter. So we don't wear the owl feathers. It's not a very sacred thing to do. So another thing here is an old axe head. You can tell where they've had that made. If you had the handle around that, you would have an axe head, and they'll use that during the time of war. This is like a war axe, and you bop people on the head with that, and these things can be picked up in the fields, and you have plenty of them down here in Iredell and Alexander County, because this was pretty well the border where the Cherokee met with the Catawba. They were located in this region, and so we have something here called a peace pipe. And this was made by one of my students. I have been carving for many years, and almost everywhere I go, we have someone come along and they want to learn how to carve, and so they'll sit with me like an apprentice. And this guy did better than I could do, so I taught him well. And it's a beautiful piece of soapstone that's used, and it came from right down here in Alexander County, in Airedale County. So it's very important. Another thing, you get flint. And this is a very hard stone that you can chip off. You can't carve it, it's so hard. It's almost like glass, and you can chip it and make arrow points. And the Cherokees use that to put on spearheads. And they also made arrow points small enough that they could shoot them in a bow and an arrow. And that was very important. And I have found this piece of stone that is so old and so rugged that they just kept chipping it. And every time you chip flint, it makes it sharp again. So they would scrape the fat off of an animal's carcass with this thing, and then take that fat and render it out and make the oil that they would cook with. Then they would use the leather to make their different pouches and things like that. So this is a very ancient, it's almost like a caveman, Native American type piece of artwork. But it's all very important, and down here in Airedale County, up on 21, you'll find a lot of soapstone. And in those soapstone areas, the stones have holes in them like that. That's not a natural thing. There have been some Native Americans who have come along and they've drilled that hole in there with a sharper piece of stone, and they grind it out, and while they're there, they may crack nuts in that. Or they may use that to put different herbs in, and sort of like a mortar and pedestal, and they will grind that up in there. And you can see their signatures on a lot of the stones. It shows that they've been here for thousands of years. And the Native American people, the most important thing is that we are still here. We're not like the dinosaur. We have not disappeared and gone away forever and ever, never to return. Our bones may be in the dirt, and our tools are on top of the ground, but we are still here as a people. The Cherokee, the Salagi Ani Yawia, it's called the principal people, the Cherokee people. So I live on the Qualla boundary in Cherokee, North Carolina, and I do a lot of soapstone carving. And there's a demand for that stuff today, because I had an artist coming here a while ago, and he was looking for different artwork. And I didn't mention that I had anything finished, because I wanted to show it here. But people collect things like that because they like to use it, they like to see it. They can appreciate the work that goes into it each and every time. How do you carve soapstone? Well, soapstone is sort of soft. And I have an old knife here that's sort of almost worn out. I used to have a long blade on it, and I've carved so much over the years that I wore the blade out, and I wrapped the thing with tape so it would not hurt my hand. So if you look very carefully, you can see that you just sort of take a little time and carve a little bit of the soapstone at a time. And it makes it a nice powdery substance come off of it. And that is basically where baby powder comes from. is the soapstone that's located down here in these counties. And you have some of the biggest soapstone quarries in North Carolina are located right here in Iredell County. So why would I want to carve something like this? Well, this is a Dak-Shing. In Cherokee, that means turtle. And the turtle would be carved as an effigy, and it would represent the continuity and the consistency. That's sort of like having your own hotel on your back wherever you go. So you don't have to depend on anyone to invite you to spend the night. You have your own house with you all the time. Sort of like some of these people who pull their mobile units along and they camp wherever they want to. And they see a lot of the beautiful mountains. And so the turtle has his little house with him all the time. The Cherokees would carve on that thing, and I've been carving on this quite a while. And then when they get it down to where it looks like it's just perfect, like I've polished this one, and you can see that it's turned out pretty shiny and beautiful. It's a good way to entertain yourself. If you come home from a job that you've been working all day long and you feel so upset and so just frustrated, well, sit down and carve a little bit. And you polish that thing up, and you can have that there to remind you of the work you've done on it. And so how do you polish it? Well, in the old days, didn't have any sandpaper. So the Indian people would go down to the river and they get a handful of sand out of the water from the, like the top of the thing, the pile of sand, because it's fine up there. Down on the bottom, it's really coarse. They start at the bottom first, and they would rub it over the carving until they begin to smooth it down, then you get some a little further up and rub it again, and then off the very top where the fine sand is gathered and rub it down, then it began to really shine. One thing you can do today is you can go buy you some sandpaper, or else you can use this Teflon pad out of the kitchen, and you just begin to rub it really gently, and it begins to really make that thing take a shine. And I've been polishing on this turtle's back for a while, and one of these days I will really finish it. So then you begin to get it rubbed down, and you rub it with your hand, and it really begins to change color and shine because it takes the oil out of your skin. So that's a very important thing to have. Take a look at that, and then over here's another one. You know, there is Mount Rushmore, and it's the presidents are on the side of this big mountain. And so I made one of these before, and before I got it finished, this guy came along and he wanted to buy it. So instead of putting the presidents of the United States, I have put like Crazy Horse, Geronimo, and all of these Native American leaders on the stone. And this one will really turn it, polish up, and really change colors a little bit. You have red in it and all that. But this is another type of stone that comes from down around New Mexico and Arizona, and it's a little harder to carve, but you can see the faces are beginning to come out in it. So we can carve people, and we can carve animals. And I'm going to be on a program in the near future. We're going to be talking about how animals have affected the lives of humans. I have a little dog at my house, and just a couple of months ago, his owners died. So the first thing they wanted to do was take the little dog, who was 8 years old, and they wanted to kill him, get rid of him. And so I said, no. They took him to 2 or 3 different vets and said, put the dog down. And they said, they're not going to do that. That dog is too healthy and he's a fine dog. We're not going to put him down. And so they brought him to me, and that little dog stays with me every day. And he comes to check on me at night, make sure I'm okay. So the animals in the world are good for human beings, and we have to learn to take care of animals, because the Native American people felt like that everything in this world is sacred. That we should appreciate and take care of all of those things instead of just going out and destroying them. And that's one reason we like to carve those things that are around us. We have elk in Cherokee, North Carolina now. If you've never had an opportunity to see elk, have your parents bring you to Cherokee, and you go up there and you see these huge creatures just sort of walking along like they own the place, and they do. They pretty well walk across the road when they want to, and people have to stop. So that's one way you can appreciate the things around you. Now you're getting wild turkeys coming into your yards down here. You have bears coming into the fields and tearing down your cornfields. And so we just have to live together, humans and animals, and that's the way it was meant to in the beginning when the Creator made this place, that animals and humans would live together. And so the Cherokees are really appreciative of everything around them. And so that's one thing that we need to learn, is to take care of our home, take care of the earth, because it's the only one we have right now. So we have to take care of our water, because that's what we drink. We have to take care of our food, and we take care of the animals that have a very important part also, and a lot of the little insects and everything like that is also very, very important. So I want to tell you a story about the creation, the way the Cherokees perceived it. It's in the very beginning of time, the Great Spirit, Ogidawada, which means grandfather in Cherokee, made the heavens and the earth was sort of muddy and wet. And so he began to look around and think, well, how am I going to find out when this thing is dry? So he sent the birds down, and they flew back and forth, but they began to get tired. After a while, he sort of said, I've sent all the birds I have, and it's still not dry yet. So there's only one bird left, and I don't think he can fly very well. So he went over and they looked at the Egwashuli, which means giant buzzard. And he said, Egwa, can you fly and check out the earth for me? He says, I know you look tired and lazy, but the old buzzard said, I can fly as long as you want me to. So he went down to the earth and began to sail. And if you ever looked at a vulture, he can sail back and forth all day, it seems, without flapping his wings very much at all. So he doesn't get tired. He just rides the air currents. He's smart. Where it gets warm, it goes up. Then he goes round and around, and he goes up, and then he sails to where he wants to go, like a glider. And at the end of the day, he will come back again. So the old buzzard was sailing across this soft, muddy earth when all of a sudden he began to get really close down to the soft mud. And he awakened and realized he's going to crash. And so he started flapping those giant wings. And they went down into the soft mud and made valleys. But when they came back up again, the mud stuck to those wings and made the mountains. And so we live in one of the most beautiful parts of the whole wide world, right here in the Blue Ridge Mountains. So they called him back and said, Kena, ulista, egwa shuli. Get back up here, hurry. So he came back up and he said, why'd you call me back? He said, because you're going to make the whole world mountainous if we didn't call you back. And so the Cherokee say this, in the land of blue smoke, Shakonagehi, is where the giant vulture, the buzzard, flew. So it's things like that, that their stories tell you how long that they've been here. And they said they were here so long that they didn't have fire. They were using animal skins to try to stay warm in the caves, but all of a sudden there was a bolt of lightning that came down out of the heavens. And it struck a sycamore tree, and that tree began to burn, and it felt so good to the animals and the people that they said, we need to get some of that. And so they sent some of the creatures over to get it. They sent the crow and the raven, it burned them jet black. And they said, we're not going back. And so they sent the screech owl, and he got burned, and his eyes turned red. And he says, I'm not going back, that stuff is dangerous. And they were about ready to give up on getting the fire, when all of a sudden the little water spider came up, and she said, what are you trying to do? They said, we're trying to get some fire, and we can't do it, it's too hot. And so she said, I can get it for you. That's no problem. They said, how can you do that? You're so tiny. And she said, I'll make a pottery vessel. And she took clay and she made a pottery vessel and she put it on her back. She went over and she got an ember of fire and put it into that little pottery vessel. And she walked back across the water. When she got back out, she dumped out the coal and it began to burn in the grass. And from that day forward, the Cherokee people have had what they call atsila, fire. And they began to plan and do things a lot differently then. They began to tell the stories like I'm telling you because they had time enough to do it, and the fire helped them keep warm. They began to cook their food, and they began to farm and stay in one place. And so the old Cherokee people believe, and I'd like for you to try this sometime, in your yard, make a little place where you can dig it up and plant the three sisters: corn, squash, and beans. And the Cherokee women knew back in those days that those three things work together. The beans give off nitrogen, which caused the corn and the squash to grow. The Cherokees would always rotate their crops, and so they did not have to leave one place and go to another. When the settlers first came here, they could stay in one place, like Cades Cove, for 15 years, and they would have completely worn out the land and move on to something else. And the Cherokees lived in one valley for 15,000 years. It didn't have to leave it because they knew how to take care of the earth. So I would like for you to, in some way, remember the Cherokee people are still here. So are the Navajo, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Tuscarora. Many, many, many tribes still live in this nation today. But just remember that we're only 0.7%, but we are still here. And I do appreciate your time today, and I appreciate having the chance to talk with you. Thank you.